Hello, Universal People. It's Jackie Sawicki and John Munich. This is the Jackie and John's People's Podcast. John, do you want to let the people know who's going to be on the podcast today?
Yeah, so today's episode is in our housing month, and today on the program, we're going to be talking to congressional candidate in California's 30th District, as well as a public health activist in Shervin, Aazami. Today, we really wanted to focus our conversation on our monthly theme, which is housing, but we also want to touch on some of those aspects of his campaign. So that's what we're going to get into today. But without further ado, let's bring Shervin onto the program. Shervin, how you doing, man?
Hey, folks. Hi, John. Hey, Jackie. Can y'all hear me okay?
Yeah, we can. Great. Welcome to the People's Basics.
Thank you for having me. Great to be here with y'all.
You're very welcome. So, Shervin, before we get into all of the nitty-gritty of housing and how that can impact our public health, which we want to spend the most of our time on, we want to talk about your own work and what inspired you to run for Congress in California's 30th District. You're a public health activist. Can you walk us through what some of those activisms were that you have been addressing in our health, and what inspired you to take the leap from activist to running for office yourself?
Absolutely. Again, thank you, Jackie and John, for having me on the People's Basics. My name is Shervin Aazami. I'm an Iranian American. I'm an immigrant. I'm a public health activist, and I'm a new dad. My wife and I welcomed our firstborn just last week. Very lucky and blessed. Thank you so much. To have a healthy first child. And I'm a public health activist running for U.S. Congress in my hometown, San Fernando Valley, California's 30th District. I'm running to unseat 24-year corporate incumbent Brad Sherman on the bold progressive values that I believe our district deserves. You mentioned my public health activism background. Before running for office, I was the Director of Congressional Relations for a national indigenous healthcare nonprofit, fighting to make sure the federal government honors its treaty obligations to tribal nations. And we were doing that work during the height of COVID-19, when we saw Native peoples being disproportionately impacted by COVID-19 deaths, hospitalization rates, infection rates. And our job was working with legislators to get direct resources for tribal governments and Native peoples. And through our advocacy, we were able to get over $4 billion in direct funding to tribal governments in the COVID-19 stimulus packages passed last Congress. Believe it or not, while $4 billion, of course, a drop in the bucket compared to the trillions Congress appropriated, it was still the first time in U.S. history that the government bailed out tribes during a public health crisis. Back during the H1N1 pandemic in 2009 and the Spanish flu pandemic before that, despite the fact that Native peoples had death rates 4 times the rate of the general population, our government sent tribes body bags as opposed to testing kits and vaccines and resources. And also, one of my proudest achievements doing work at the national level was getting legislation passed that canceled copays and deductibles for Native American veterans, getting us one step closer to single-payer Medicare for all, which is one of the top priorities for our campaign. And, as a public health activist, we really try to look at issues as comprehensively and holistically as possible, as opposed to addressing issues in silos, tinkering around the edges, and moving with more incremental stopgap measures. Instead, we try to look at the root causes of why we see such high poverty rates, why we see such high racial inequities, why do we have such a high rate of homelessness, of housing inequity, why are our climate justice issues not being addressed head on, and saying to ourselves, what kinds of bold, structural, transformative policies do we need to be able to uplift and empower working people, dismantle white supremacy, and end corporate welfare? And that's what our campaign is all about. I think about the fact that here in our district, over 480,000 registered voters, yet we have a representative that has failed to champion the needs of working people. Over a third of our state's 3.4 million uninsured reside in Los Angeles in our district. We have over 66,000 unhoused Angelenos, roughly 8,000 to 10,000 of which live here in the San Fernando Valley. We had the largest natural gas blowout in U.S. history happen in our district back in 2015. 109,000 metric tons of methane released into the air. And yet our congressman is still funded by the very corporations that have been exacerbating these crises. 98% of his campaign contributors are weapons manufacturers, private prisons, commercial banks, private equity firms, and credit card companies. And I believe that for too long, we've had corporate Democrats and corporate Republicans across both sides of the aisle failing to meet our communities where they are at. It's time for bold solutions, and progressives like myself who proudly accept zero corporate PAC money. I am the only candidate in this race who has taken the Sunrise Movement pledge for good jobs for all, investing $10 trillion over the next decade into renewable energy, union-backed green energy jobs. I'm the only candidate to take the Code Pink pledge to divest from the U.S. war machine. I'm the only candidate running on housing as an inherent human right and a housing for all policy. I'm the only candidate running on a progressive taxation system to ensure that our billionaires and millionaires and corporations pay their fair share in taxes. Because as we saw during the COVID-19 pandemic, as millions of people lost their employer-based healthcare coverage, lost their homes, lost their wages, our country minted 40 new billionaires. They collectively increased their wealth by trillions of dollars, while people at the bottom 99% lost their livelihoods. Enough is enough. We need bold change, and that's what our campaign's all about.
That's awesome, Shervin. So let me ask you a question. That's first of all Brad Sherman, right? That's the guy who's currently the incumbent in office. Can you explain us a little bit more about the district itself?
Sure.
So you said it's the San Fernando Valley. For those who have not been there or not even from California themselves, can you let them in and know what that district is kind of like?
I'd love to. Yeah, the San Fernando Valley, part of the city of Los Angeles. Our district, like I said, over 480,000 registered voters. We have a beautiful and vibrant community. We have a huge population of foreign-born individuals. Over 40% of the folks in our district are foreign-born, myself included. I'm the proud son of two Iranian asylum seekers who fled religious persecution in Iran and emigrated to the Valley when I was an infant. Los Angeles is lovingly referred to as Tehrangeles. It has the largest population of Iranians outside of Iran. And our district also boasts a very strong Latinx population. Over a third of our district are Latinx. And yet we see a representative, Brad Sherman, that's receiving money from private prison and detention centers. That's not pushing towards a movement to abolish ICE and divest from carceral punishment and invest in a humanitarian immigration system. He's someone who, while he may claim to be a progressive, voted more often with Trump than he did with Democrats. And during his 24-year incumbency, he's gotten two bills passed, one under Trump and the other one under Bush. The one under Bush was a name change to a post office in our district. The one under Trump were sanctions on China. Meanwhile, like I said, we have so many issues in our district. And I know we're talking about housing. And this is one that I really want to grill Brad Sherman on. Because believe it or not, he's actually the guy that can do something about our housing crisis. Not just saying that because he's a federal rep. I say that because he chairs the Investor Protection, Entrepreneurship, and Capital Markets Subcommittee on Financial Services. That subcommittee has jurisdiction over our federal housing finance laws, over Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, over U.S. securities, and over authorizing new affordable housing programs. And guess what? The second he became chair of that committee, that subcommittee last cycle, BlackRock and Blackstone, the two Wall Street corporate landlords, started bankrolling his reelection campaign. A few weeks ago, when the Financial Services Committee had a full committee hearing with Wall Street CEOs, Brad Sherman, my opponent, congratulated them for a job well done during COVID-19. It doesn't get any more disgraceful than that.
Wow.
So the guy is completely out of touch. He's failed to champion the needs of working people. Enough is enough. I'm proud to say that I got more bills passed in 2 years as an advocate on Capitol Hill than Brad Sherman has in 24 as a legislator.
So that kind of leads to the question, what makes you think, I guess because you're not taking any corporate PAC money, you think that will enable you to be freer to make those kind of legislative, changes that maybe are holding these corporate Democrats and Republicans back.
Absolutely.
They don't want to. offend their cash flow.
That's correct. Let me give you a great example. So what we've seen since the 2008 economic crash is Wall Street stepping in and buying out hundreds of thousands of single-family homes across the entire country. When we think about the economic crash, that was the single greatest eliminator of Black wealth in U.S. history. And the Black community still has not recovered from that devastating loss. Instead, when we saw bills like Dodd-Frank be enacted in the wake of the 2008 crash, what we saw is our federal government giving more incentives for Wall Street firms to start buying out single-family homes. And now, 1/5 of all single-family homes nationwide are owned by private equity firms, are owned by pension funds, which means that if you're a new home buyer, first-time home buyer, if you're a young couple, a young family, you're competing with Wall Street for your first home. And that's created a gigantic housing bubble, and it's caused millions of Americans to fall more into the rental market. And we're seeing corporate landlords step in and destroy the rental market as well. Here in Los Angeles, over 2/3 of Angelenos are renters. Now, Los Angeles, the San Fernando Valley is unique in this sense because, and we haven't talked about the generational impacts of redlining, but the reason why the San Fernando Valley has such an abundance of single-family homes is because it was created as a white enclave for decades. And the more multifamily housing we had, the more that meant people of color, low-income communities moving into the valley, and a lot of those wealthy white suburban homeowners did not want that. And so we're still trying to overcome that racist legacy, and we need the policies to do it. I firmly believe that budgets are moral documents. They reflect our values and our priorities. And when we spend $740 billion annually on the military, and less than 5% of that on housing, less than 7% of that on education, it demonstrates our focus is not on helping working people. It's in propping up the weapons industry. We could eradicate homelessness in America with just 10% of the Pentagon budget, a one-year appropriation of the Pentagon budget.
I've been asking,
policy choice? Sorry to interrupt you.
No. I totally agree. I've been asking for years now. It's like, what happened to the anti-war Democrats? Like, when they get in power, it's okay. It's a just war then, like, I don't understand why there were some of the largest protests in history going up to the Iraq war, and it wasn't covered in the media. And now it just, like, it never happened. And
my opponent, Brad Sherman, he voted for the war in Iraq. He voted for the war in Afghanistan. He's voted against divesting from the Saudi-led genocide in Yemen. He's voted against new arms deals to foreign nations. It's despicable. Again and again, we're seeing our resources move towards a military-industrial complex, move towards a militarized policing system, move towards carceral punishment at the direct expense of people of color and working communities. Enough is enough.
Yeah. And, to that investment part, you were talking before about the impact of Wall Street on the housing market. And you were right when you talk about who are the people getting actually bailed out, who's getting these nice, affordable loans. When you give this basic cushion to these groups that otherwise would have went under these big banks, what happens? They take this money and then they say, hey, all of you are now getting evicted. We're going to buy up all these homes and we're going to expand out. And as you said, you're now having these actual mom and pops or whoever who are trying to buy their first home have to compete with these groups that are being inflated by the national government through the Fed or what have you. And so I think you're right. When it comes to ending homelessness, we've had estimates where it's only $30 billion a year. And as you just pointed out, the military industrial complex's budget is ranging in the $700 billion range. And it's not necessarily going all to personnel. A lot of it's going to the weaponries and the military industrial complex. So I think you're right. We have to focus on where is this money going? Because we have nearly enough stock and supply. We have, I think it's roughly like an 8-to-1 ratio right now of housing that is vacant to the homelessness population. So it's really just a prioritization effort. And so
on that front, if you don't let me interrupt you really fast.
Go ahead.
That's a really, really important component of it, because here in Los Angeles, we're seeing even nonprofit developers, in addition to commercial developers, they are prioritizing buying up vacant land and building affordable housing as opposed to buying up modular buildings and transforming them into permanent supportive housing. Why?
Yeah.
There's more money in buying up the vacant land and building from the ground up, as opposed to making those easy transits. We could do that with such little investment, make it actually economically efficient and feasible to turn these modular buildings into permanent supportive housing. But instead, we're seeing profit be maximized at the expense of actually putting people into homes. Now, I think, John, you also asked about, what could Congress have done differently in the wake of the '08 crash? Well, one thing they could have done at that point, we had a 10-year ban, now an over 20-year ban, back then over a 10-year ban on new federal funds for public housing. It was an austerity measure enacted under the Clinton administration called the Faircloth Amendment that basically gutted any new federal financing for the construction of new public housing. Congress could have lifted that back in 2008. We could have enacted a basic income back in 2008 to put money in the hands of people and consumers to go out there and keep themselves afloat. We did not do that. Instead, we provided bailouts to Wall Street like we've been talking about. We could have provided more protections for tenants. We could have eliminated exclusionary zoning, which is a policy by which you have an entire neighborhood where you can only build single-family homes. You can't do multifamily housing. You can't do apartments or condos or anything else. It has to be single-family. Well, that, again, prioritizes wealthy individuals and leaves working-class, middle-class Americans behind. There are all sorts of things we could have done differently if the prioritization was in the hands of the people and bailing out Americans like Jackie, like you were talking about. But instead, because people like Brad Sherman are financed by corporations, they are doing their bidding in Congress.
Yeah, 2008 like really kind of radicalized me in that
a lot of people.
We had just bought our first starter house. We were going to flip it because that was like at the height of the flipping. Everybody was buying cheap houses, fixing them up and like reselling them. And we bought it in 2007, and then the crash happened, and we ended up staying there for 10 years. My mom lost her house she had one of those adjustable rate mortgages. And, she'd been paying on that house for decades. And then all of a sudden she owed more than, she bought it for. And so what's really frustrating is the house sat there vacant for years. Like she could have honestly squatted. And so they're doing this and they're not even filling these homes, which is like part of that 8-to-1 ratio, So we asked ourselves, how could we become more resilient? Because it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. The banks are bigger than they ever were. It's like nothing changed. They put a Band-Aid, kissed the boo-boo and pretended like we're good and we're not good. And then, so when COVID happened, and I thought for sure this would be like everybody would adopt UBI because it's just so obvious. Even if you can't work, like even if you want to work and you can't work, you shouldn't freaking lose your home. You shouldn't not be able to feed your children. And so I'm so like just angry that it's happening all over again. I'm old enough now that I remember '08, and I thought surely we wouldn't allow this. Surely we would have like protests, like camping out, like Occupy something, and we're just it needs to get to this kind of tipping point because I don't understand how so many people are okay right now with how incredibly unfair everything is.
Yeah, and just I wanted to add on to that, we're right now, facing these continual moratoriums on evictions that is soon going to be expiring. What do you think is the solution? Because eventually, like, the moratoriums might end, do you have the position that people shouldn't ever be evicted? How do you think we can actually handle that kind of transition process where right now we've been kicking the can down the road?
I want to touch on that and talk about the Rent and Mortgage Cancellation Act, John, but really quickly, going back to one of Jackie's earlier points, my family also bought their first home during the subprime mortgage crisis. And my father at that time, my parents, like I said, fled religious persecution. They're asylum seekers here in America. My dad went back to school to become a primary care physician. And it was right around that time that he was able to get his license again and start working. But the practice he was working with was embroiled in their own scandal. And so for almost a year, my father was not being paid. And we were getting eviction notices. We were at the brink of losing our home. When I was 16 years old, I was writing letter after letter after letter to Wells Fargo, pleading with them to please not foreclose our home. And, we were incredibly lucky to be able to hold on to it. Millions of Americans were not as lucky as we were. And I think
and we're illegally foreclosed on as well.
Exactly,
I think that, like, I don't understand how those companies like Bank of America get to continue when they kicked people out of their homes.
Because Congress bailed them out. People like Brad Sherman bailed them out. And going back to Brad Sherman's very first term, one of the very first bills he voted for was the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act. What that bill did was essentially gut the the Glass-Steagall Act and allow investment banks and commercial banks to consolidate and start doing all these risky bets on housing, which everyone thought was a sure market, never would crash. But as they started making these riskier and riskier bets, what happened? Millions of people lost their homes. And that is on people like Brad for prioritizing corporations at the expense of everybody else. Now, on the question of the eviction moratorium, even though we had a federal eviction moratorium that expires at the end of this month, Los Angeles also has eviction moratorium. Guess what? Corporate landlords like BlackRock have still been evicting people with zero consequences. Thousands of people have lost their homes and no one has stepped in. There's been no enforcement to hold these corporations accountable. Why? Because, Jackie, like you said, we think they're too big to fail. And so when we think about what the solutions need to look like, we need to empower tenants. We need to pass a basic income. If COVID-19 is not our clarion call for single payer Medicare for all, as millions lose their employer-based healthcare coverage, I don't know what is. Yeah. And to see Republicans and even conservative Democrats say, well, these unemployment benefits are the reason why people aren't going back to work. I'm sorry. I thought competition was the hallmark of capitalism. Right. Why aren't companies competing for better labor with higher wages? Why isn't that the way we're looking at the issue? Why aren't we enacting a basic income? Why are we limiting it to people making only $75,000 a year? Now, my universal basic income platform would only exclude the top 3% of earners. Under my plan, it would include everyone, every individual making up to $150,000 a year, and every household making up to $300,000 a year. That covers 97% of American households. It excludes the top 3%. Why? Because in my opinion, Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos don't need help from taxpayers. It's the bottom 97% that do. And so going back, John, to your comment about the eviction moratorium, I'm a huge supporter of Representative Ilhan Omar's Rent and Mortgage Cancellation Act. And I'm also a huge supporter of providing retroactive UBI going back to the beginning of the pandemic. We need money in the hands of people to survive, to get themselves back on their feet, to stimulate our economy, to lift themselves out of poverty. And with the Rent and Mortgage Cancellation Act, not only does it protect renters and mortgage holders, it also helps small-time landlords that rely on mortgage income to survive. Why? Because it also provides those payments and bailouts to those small-time landlords. So it's a pretty comprehensive bill, but it hasn't even gotten a hearing. And instead, we're seeing further and further prioritization of stopgap measures, incremental changes, as opposed to addressing the root cause.
Yeah, I'm glad to hear that you're supportive of Ilhan Omar's bill, but I actually wanted to clarify one point you said about the Universal Basic Income Plan,
yes.
About it being the 97%. I just wanted to know why even introduce the means testing as an administrative thing. I ask because you're clearly a supporter of single payer, which again would be the notion of giving healthcare to these billionaires, essentially. So why do something different for a universal basic income and add that layer of administration where people still have to then do the paperwork to get means tested and have to reapply consistently?
Well, you know what? One thing I want to clarify on this policy, and one thing I want to say is, as a policy analyst by training, I wrote each and every single one of the policies on our website. From our Housing for All platform to our Medicare for All platform to legislating on the Green New Deal and everything in between. And as I was saying earlier, again, in my opinion, it's not folks like Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos that require an extra $1,000 a month in taxpayer funding assistance or however much it's going to be. Instead, again, using that public health lens, it's prioritizing the resources to where they are needed most, which is why my platform also includes a $2,000 payment for unhoused individuals and formerly incarcerated folks, people that are in need of greater assistance to get themselves back on their feet and get lifted out of poverty, recognizing, again, that formerly incarcerated folks are disproportionately impacted by poverty, which is one of the greatest indicators of recidivism rates. Now, one thing I also want to say is that the whole point about excluding the top 3%, I want to make it perfectly clear, this is not the hill that I'm going to die on. Okay, I designed the policy this way, but I am very open to conversation around how to make that better. I firmly believe in a progressive taxation system, and I'm very open to talking about, well, all right, if we want to make it universal, how do we ensure that we're actually bringing that money back from the households that don't need that extra assistance from the federal government? And also, I firmly believe that healthcare, education, housing, those are inherent human rights. Those are places where we need government assistance. And we need the government to step in and provide those essential government services, in my opinion. I'm also of the mind that basic income is becoming something similar in terms of a guaranteed need. Again, not the hill that I'm going to die on, but in my mind at this moment, again, thinking that we should be prioritizing resources where they are needed most.
I think that's a reasonable debate point, and I'd love to go back and forth on that. But I want to get back to some of the to the housing questions more, because I wanted to wrap up on more the rights you were talking about that tenants kind of need, and also kind of the innovative supply of how we can actually build new public housing. How do you think we should have this administration of where public housing should be placed and developed and managed within a community? Because you have certain things that kind of like become like homeowners co-ops, where they basically have their own version of kind of control that has some level of democracy varying by homeowners association that you want to basically have in there. And I wanted to ask, how do you manage where those types of facilities are coming? Do you leave that up to the individual communities, which sometimes leads to that problem of people just saying no?
Not in my backyard.
Like how do you want to try and address that of where does it get placed? And
the not in my backyard, the Nimbyism, I believe, is one of the greatest impediments to recognizing housing as a human right and passing measures like housing for all. And that's why one of my top policies is banning exclusionary zoning, because exclusionary zoning allows communities to say, no, we don't want affordable housing here. We don't want multifamily housing here. We only want wealthy single-family homes. We can't operate like that anymore. I believe a community that takes care of one another is a community that thrives together, that improves together, that uplifts and empowers each other. And on the topic of tenant rights, our platform also includes banning discrimination based on tenant source of income, including public assistance. Because right now, we're seeing landlords saying, well, you got Section 8 voucher housing, we're not going to let you in. That is discrimination, in my opinion. And we need to strengthen anti-discrimination laws to include a ban on discrimination based on tenant source of income. I also believe we need to provide a tax break to renters that are paying over a third of their income to rent. Here in Los Angeles, we already had the fight for 15. We enacted a $50 minimum wage, but guess what? Because cost of living is so darn high in LA, you got to be making $38 an hour to avoid paying over a third of your income to rent. Well, that's leaving sanitation workers behind. That's leaving teachers behind. That's leaving service industry workers behind. That's leaving food service workers behind. And so we need to be providing those bailouts again to working people. I also believe that we need to ban no-cause evictions, no-fault and one-strike evictions. These are evictions that allow landlords to retain a lot of discretion to evict renters really without any cause, just because they want to. Because they want to either sell the unit to a corporate landlord or do something else, they take away the rights of tenants. I believe we need to preserve and expand and protect tenant rights across the entire country. And at the same time, we need to eliminate all legal barriers to federal housing assistance for undocumented Angelenos and undocumented people across the entire country. Undocumented folks face heavy discrimination in the housing market. And Los Angeles is home to a huge amount of undocumented folks that are not able to get the essential services they need. We need to be humanitarian in our approaches. We need to decriminalize our immigration system and invest in the needs of our communities.
Yeah, that when you talked about evicting people for no reason, I'm reminded I lived in that house for 10 years, and one of our neighbors were a family of 5, a mom and dad and 3 kids, and they were renters. They weren't owners. And the Dallas housing market and subsequent like suburban areas is really, really hot right now. And so even though those folks had been really good tenants and they raised their children there, they had to leave because the owners wanted to sell the house because it was so hot they could make such a huge profit. And it's just it's very sad because this housing market, this new bubble, is tearing the fabric of communities apart, because there's a lot of gentrification and there's a lot of people who are having to leave their homes that they don't want to leave. I also had a question, if you don't mind, one more about, so we also in the '08 crash, we wanted to live a little more simply and even maybe do the tiny thing. Can you speak about, so it was very hard to find property or even a home or even a neighborhood that would allow tiny housing or alternative housing, like I'm thinking like 3D printed houses. There's square foot minimums that I think is very discriminatory. If you want to live simply and frugally, it's almost like you have to sink your life savings into a house when there's more totally more cost efficient, and the way that we have to live on grid. I'm not like super hippie, but I am. And the way that we have to be changed to these utilities rather than being getting subsidies to be more energy efficient and independent. That's really, really something that's I've had to jump through hoops myself.
No, that's a great point. And it's a huge topic of discussion here in Los Angeles, actually. One thing I will say out of the gate, when it comes to tiny homes to address the issue of homelessness, I am not the biggest fan, but I do honor the inherent agency of our unhoused neighbors to make the best decision for them. If they believe that a tiny home is the transitional need that they require to get themselves back on their feet, that is their inherent right and constitutional right to be able to do so. I believe at the same time, though, for example, here in the Valley, we opened up a series of tiny homes in Reseda. These tiny homes, I got to tell you, don't quote me on this number, but I believe tiny homes are roughly in the 300 to 400 square foot range. 400
usually, yeah. Mm-hmm.
These tiny homes are around 100.
Oh my gosh, yeah.
Yeah, around only 100 square feet with a tiny little shack for a bed and communal bathrooms and showers. They're under 24/7, either private security or police surveillance. A lot of them have very strict sobriety requirements. They don't even allow family members to be able to come visit communities who live in these tiny homes. There is no such logical reason for that. And a lot of these tiny homes and shelters very much operate as soft incarceration because of the fact that they're under 24/7 surveillance, because of the strict sobriety requirements, because that you can't even bring in family members. And this is a gigantic issue, again, here in Los Angeles, where we're seeing the response to homelessness be more and more policing and incarceration. Pretty much every Monday for the past few months, I've been joining local advocacy organizations, the West Valley People's Alliance, and going out and assisting our unhoused neighbors that are being exposed to destructive sweeps. Sweeps are areas where Los Angeles set up these what's known as SEZ zones, special enforcement and cleanup zones. It's basically little zones in the city that cops can come in and displace folks with impunity. And when I say displace, I literally mean arrive at 7 a.m. in the morning, make them move their things 15 feet over or 30 feet over. How is that a solution to homelessness?
Just harassment. Yeah.
Pure harassment. And we're spending millions of dollars. A study commissioned by HUD and the Federal Department of Health and Human Services found that cities are spending millions of dollars on these destructive sweeps, and they're not seeing any gains and reductions in homelessness or in getting people into housing. Why are we putting more and more money into military police systems when they are not working? We cannot incarcerate and police our way out of homelessness. We simply can't.
Yeah, I think that's an amazing
We're gonna try,
point
though.
in that. We're definitely going to try in America right now.
First.
But it reminds me of this point. I think it's a great way to close on the notion that, we can't be just embracing a model of housing that's going to get people harassed more and more by the police.
Right.
You know, I jokingly say that the housing guarantee we have in America is go commit a crime and they'll throw you in jail and you'll get shelter. Like, that's the way we have a housing guarantee in America, just like we have a healthcare guarantee in America of just show up to the healthcare of the emergency room and get your bill and go bankrupt, but you got your healthcare. We need to be doing these universal housing and healthcare solutions that are a bit more humanitarian rather than having to go bankrupt at the emergency room and commit crime to get into a shelter or live in a mini home that's going to be
incredibly
over-policed.
dark way of looking at it, but you have a point there.
Yeah, it's exactly the point. But
we are reactive and not proactive, and that's what
Exactly.
you talk about.
Exactly.
Going back to the root of the issue. The root is poverty. The root is
Right.
mental health crisis. I mean, there's like we have what I call stupid simple solutions. Like, we know what we can do, like UBI, that would like lift people out of poverty. Like, you don't want poor people, give them money. Guess what? They're not poor anymore. But like, where are we going to get the money? They don't ask where we're going to get the money for endless wars. But when it comes to helping people and like making people's lives better, and children, we have children in poverty. It is immoral, this country. The wealth and the wealth gap and disparity is immoral. We have so many children that are hungry and homeless, and it's infuriating.
That's right.
There's a great Twitter feed that's like, has Jeff Bezos ended world hunger yet? And every day this Twitter feed says like, nope, today is not the day that Jeff Bezos, he could finger. Yeah. And so we can't. Yeah, we can't. I mean, like, I don't stand Elon Musk. He is not. What is it? Iron Man. Like, Elon Musk is not the Avengers. He's not going to help us.
No. But
we need to elect. We need to elect those people. Mm-hmm.
I agree.
So Shervin, I just wanted to ask you, since we're approaching the end of our time, do you have any final words of how you would want people to be able to assist you in your campaign, or how they can get more information about your campaign?
Absolutely. Please visit our website, Shervin4thevalley.com. We are a people-first progressive campaign running on the bold progressive policies we need: single-payer Medicare for all, housing as a human right, a decriminalized immigration system, legislating on the Green New Deal, divesting from the U.S. war machine, basic income, and much, much more, food security. And look, here in our community, in terms of getting involved, I am proud to say that we have over 111 amazing volunteers working with our campaign, over 47% of which are under the age of 30. Our youngest volunteer is 13 years old. To our eldest volunteer, who's a senior, we are so proud of the incredible energy our campaign is bringing. Like I said earlier, our campaign is the only campaign running on a Housing for All platform, been running since day one on single-payer Medicare for all, since day one on the Green New Deal, on abolishing ICE, on a progressive taxation system. We're the only campaign that's taken the no fossil fuel money pledge, the no cop money pledge, the Green New Deal pledge, the patients over profits pledge, which means no health insurance, no pharma money. We are exclusively empowered by progressive working people that want to see a change in government, a government that works for them, that invests in their needs, not in the needs of corporations in the top 1%.
Well, Shervin, we want to thank you for bringing your message to us here. We're going to be including that link to the website for all of you who want to explore more or get involved in helping Shervin out. You'll be able to find that in the description section below. But
would you like to meet our son really quickly just to close it out?
Oh, sure. Yeah, of course. We'd love to meet your new son.
The new little baby.
Oh, yes. Just waking up from a nap. And he's also got his dad's logo on his onesie.
Oh, that's awesome.
Little baby Barrett.
What's the child's name?
Barrett.
Barrett?
Aazami. Yeah,
oh, well,
so cute. Little sweet. Oh my gosh, I want to squish it. Oh my gosh, you're so adorable. Congratulations. There is nothing like that.
So
Congratulations.
Much. Thank you.
I mean, he is the reason why we keep fighting onward to provide a better future.
Right.
So we're very thankful for people like yourself fighting the good fight out there, and we hope people will continue to check you out. So Shervin, thank you so much for stopping by.
Love to be here with you all. Take care.
Take care, Shervin. Okay, everyone. So that was Shervin Aazami. I know we were so treated there with the baby at the end.
Yes.
So again, just as a reminder to the folks out there, please check the description section down below to find more information about Shervin's campaign. As well, you'll always find our own links. You'll find our link tree to find all the links at the network to get connected to our communities, sign up for episodes, and more. So, Jackie, I want to ask, do you have any final thoughts that you want to share as we wrap up today's episode?
I would just reiterate that in the richest country in the history of humankind, to have homeless children and mothers and fathers and veterans, like all the homeless seniors are one of the fastest growing homeless populations. It's immoral. It's infuriating. We can do more. We have got to insist that we do more. And like, it starts with maybe not giving the military industrial complex billions and billions, unquestioned, unanswered, yeah, it'd be great.
Yeah, I think I'm going to echo that too. It's a prioritization question. We talked about this today. What is the actual cost of ending homelessness? It's $30 billion. Folks, we spent $6.3 trillion. We're spending nearly $700 billion a year on the military industrial complex. We're giving billions away in foreign aid to countries like Israel to the tune of $3.2 billion, where we can be collecting these funds and saying, hey, let's invest here at home. I think the best foreign policy is building security here at home, building that internal strength. So we were really glad that we got to have a very intersectional conversation today with Shervin. So as always, check the description section down below to get connected with his campaign as well as with our network. That being said, Universal People, that's going to do it for another episode of the John and Jackie People Podcast. We hope you all have a great day out there. Yes, and as always, stay classy out there, Universal People.